Welcome back to Little Mizzlewick, where spring has arrived with damp pavements, bright notices, and the quiet threat of a village organised by Belinda Armitage. In the Great Spring Clean, one Saturday clear-out begins with skips by the village hall and ends in Gavin Price's famously overburdened shed, where clutter, old promises, and one long-silent pub secret are waiting to be brought into the light.
The notice. The announcement appeared on the board outside St Jude's on the first Monday of April, written in Belinda Armitage's decisive hand. The paper was cream-coloured, the lettering precise, and the message unmistakable. Little Mizzlewick Spring Clean, Saturday 20th of April, 9 a.m. onwards. All residents encouraged to participate. Refreshments provided. Rubbish skips positioned at Village Hall. Nora Field, who passed the notice board twice a day, as a matter of habit rather than necessity, stood before it for a moment longer than strictly required, reading it with the attentiveness she gave to all new additions. By Tuesday morning, she had already fielded 6 queries about what constituted clutter versus things worth keeping. The distinction, it turned out, was not as straightforward as Belinda's lettering implied. By Wednesday, the debate had reached the shepherd's crook. June Marsh had adopted the ruthless efficiency approach without hesitation. Clear it out, make space, move forward, she announced to the assembled Wednesday regulars, in the tone she used for pronouncements about compost ratios and the correct way to stake runner beans. There was no arguing with June when she used that tone. Several people nodded without committing to anything. Eleanor Vance, who had been nursing a half of bitter and a fairly demanding crossword, glanced up with the expression of someone filing something away for later use. That philosophy works rather well for things, she said. It gets more complicated when the things stand in for something else. June looked at her. Everything does, if you think about it long enough. Precisely, said Eleanor, and returned to 6 across. The consensus, by Thursday morning, was that everyone in Little Mizzlewick was making excellent progress with their spring preparations. Everyone was organising, sorting, reconsidering. Everyone was ready to begin. Everyone except Gavin Price. His shed had acquired legendary status over the years, evolving from simple storage into something approaching archaeological significance, the kind of significance that is discussed with a mixture of admiration and concern at village gatherings. Tom Armitage, who had helped Gavin move a broken lawnmower the previous summer, had offered the definitive account one Wednesday evening at the Crook, accepting his pint from Arthur with the satisfied air of someone who had done a day's honest work and earned his refreshment. Thought he was storing half the Industrial Revolution in there, Tom said. Couldn't see the back wall, tried to get past something that might once have been a rotary cultivator and had to retreat. Couldn't tell you what decade most of it belongs to. Arthur had smiled, polishing glasses with his methodical care, setting each one on the bar with a small, deliberate click. Above him, the old clock sat silent and beautiful, its brass face catching the lamplight, its hands fixed permanently at 11:15. Arthur glanced at it occasionally with an expression of quiet, inexplicable affection, the kind of look reserved for things whose usefulness has long since become beside the point. Someone should rally round before Belinda stages an intervention, Lucy Carter said. She had come in at her usual evening half of lager and had caught the end of Tom's account. You know how she is when a project encounters obstacles. Eleanor looked up from her crossword again. Like a particularly purposeful tide, she said. Patient, inevitable, and not very interested in the obstacle's opinion of the situation. That's Belinda, Arthur agreed. Leo Turnbull, who had been filming the exchange from his usual corner table for his steadily growing YouTube channel, leaned forward with the look of someone whose documentary instincts had been engaged. He reported having attempted to get footage of the shed the previous afternoon and finding that the door opened approximately 18 inches before encountering something large, metallic, and comprehensively unwilling to shift. He had not been able to identify the object. He had not been especially surprised. On Thursday morning, Gavin felt the weight of impending intervention when he opened his kitchen door and looked down the garden. The shed sat at the end, squat and obstinate, its felt roof patched with materials from 3 different decades, its hinges a testament to rust, and the kind of patience that does not come from virtue, but from the steady accumulation of tasks deferred. A faded blue tarpaulin was tied over one corner where the felt had given up entirely, rucked by winter into shapes that suggested it had been arguing with itself. He made tea and stood on the back step, cupping the mug as though it might contain some supplementary resource, alongside the caffeine and warmth. The April morning air was clean and pointed, carrying the particular freshness of early spring, the world smelling of damp earth and possibility, and the faint green sharpness of things beginning to push through the soil. "You'll be all right," he told the shed, which was a ridiculous thing to say. Sheds neither heard nor required reassurance. He laughed at himself, a short, self-deprecating sound. Then he said it again, quietly, and this time he was not talking to the shed. Neither his shed nor his recently clicking knees seemed especially convinced by the statement, but Gavin took a breath, set down the mug on the step, and went to fetch the keys from the hook beside the back door. A flash of orange appeared from the direction of the side gate, low and purposeful. Gavin blinked. The cat that came round the corner was unmistakably Cinders, Lucy's marmalade station cat, who had apparently decided that Thursday morning offered sufficient reason to extend his usual territory by a considerable distance. He wound once around Gavin's ankles with the unhurried authority of a cat who regards the entire village as falling broadly within his jurisdiction, then stalked towards the shed with the air of a health inspector arriving unannounced. "You're a long way from the station," Gavin told him. Cinders sat on the shed step and began washing his face with elaborate concentration, which provided all the answer available on the subject. The shed keys hung on the hook beside the back door, a small collection of them on a ring that also bore a broken compass, and a bottle opener Gavin had no memory of acquiring. He selected the shed key, slightly bent. From that time, he had tried to force the lock during a rainstorm rather than admit he had the wrong key, and headed down the garden path with the specific resignation of someone walking towards something both inevitable and almost certainly unpleasant. Cinders followed at a supervised distance, tail raised, posture indicating that someone needed to maintain standards here. Then he heard voices at the front gate. Multiple voices, accompanied by the sound of purposeful footsteps and what was unmistakably the flat cardboard knock of folded boxes being carried with determination. The intervention had arrived rather earlier than he had hoped. Lucy and Nora came round the side path first. Nora was carrying her canvas bag as though it contained essential equipment for a considered and thorough operation. Lucy bore a thermos flask and an expression of patient encouragement, the kind usually reserved for people about to undertake something they have been putting off for some time and know it. Behind them came Tom Armitage, who had clearly been recruited with a combination of good character and the implicit promise of cake at the midway point. Gavin held the garden gate open, attempting to project a confidence he did not particularly feel. "Enter at your peril," he said, aiming for light and welcoming. It came out thinner than intended. Nora patted his arm with her particular quality of understanding, which managed to be warm without being pitying. "We'll be gentle with it," she said. "We're only making room for the living to breathe." The shed door stuck, as doors do when they have not been properly used in some time, the wood swollen with winter damp and reluctant to participate. When it finally yielded to Tom's shoulder, the air that came out smelled of creosote and linseed oil, of half-finished projects and possibilities that had seemed entirely reasonable when they were first conceived. Inside, the shed revealed itself in layers. A bicycle frame missing its back wheel leaned against the left wall beside towers of wood offcuts, each piece saved for a future purpose that had not yet presented itself. 3 paint tins with their lids rusted shut, occupied a corner beside a stack of plant pots from which compost had crumbled in long dried arcs. A car jack of uncertain vintage sat beside a collection of tools that had lost their handles without quite losing their usefulness in Gavin's assessment. Lengths of hose pipe had been coiled and stacked like geological strata. Along the back, invisible from the door, shelves had been colonised by boxes, each one labelled in Gavin's handwriting with optimistic categories. Useful, possibly useful, ask Dad. Tom whistled low and long. Blimey. Cinders slipped past their legs and immediately claimed the highest box as his observation post, settling into a position from which he could supervise the proceedings without being expected to contribute to them. At least someone's found their ideal workplace, Lucy observed, setting down the thermos and surveying the interior with the methodical attention of someone calculating how long this was actually going to take. Right then, Nora said, producing the flattened boxes with the efficiency of someone who had come prepared for precisely this. Shall we make a start? Gavin stood in the doorway, looking at 10 years of good intentions given physical form, and thought, spring cleaning is not supposed to feel quite this much like excavating your own conscience. From his box throne, Cinders blinked at him, slowly and with great composure. There was nothing for it but to begin. The shed. They had been working for perhaps 20 minutes when Belinda Armitage appeared at the garden gate, Pippa at her side carrying what appeared to be industrial-strength bin bags and a cheerful determination that matched her future mother-in-law's. Heard you'd started without us, Belinda says, surveying the items already arranged along the garden path with the quick assessor's eye of a woman who has organised more events than she can count. Thought we'd offer reinforcements. Gavin, who had been attempting to explain to Lucy why a collection of jam jars with missing lids might yet prove essential, felt his resolve weaken further. Belinda Armitage, in organisational mode, was a force of nature, but a benevolent one. Things happened around her, got sorted and stacked and decided upon, and you were usually grateful afterwards, even if you had not been quite willing at the time. The more the merrier, he managed. His tone did not entirely convince anyone present. Pippa set down her bags beside the shed entrance with a warmth that was entirely genuine. Jamie sends his apologies, said something about strategic retreat being the better part of valour once his mother gets that look. Sensible boy, Tom muttered, which earned him an amused glance from Belinda that suggested she had heard perfectly well. They established a working system without much discussion, the kind of organisation that emerges naturally when there are enough people with complementary temperaments. Nora positioned herself near the shed entrance, receiving items as they came out and making calm, firm decisions about their fate with the authority of someone who has kept a village notice board for 30 years and knows something about what endures. Lucy took charge of the keep pile, arranging it along the garden wall with the precision of someone accustomed to managing timetables where the order of things genuinely matters. Tom handled the lifting, which constituted approximately 60% of the operation. Belinda managed traffic with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had been directing people to the right place for most of her adult life. Pippa worked alongside Gavin in the shed itself, her quietness making the confined space feel less claustrophobic, her occasional observations practical and unjudging. It helped. They unearthed treasures and puzzles in equal measure. His grandfather's old bicycle pump emerged from behind a stack of paint tins, still functional after all these years. Gavin turned it over in his hands for a moment before Lucy gently took it from him and placed it on the keep pile without making anything of it. Bent lawnmower blades had no conceivable future and went into the rubbish. A tin of varnish, opened and resealed badly, had dried to a solid mass. Several lengths of copper pipe that Gavin retained with genuine conviction that they would be needed received a measured look from Tom, who said nothing but put them in the keep pile anyway, on the grounds that Tom knew what copper pipe was worth. Vintage electrical wiring made Tom suck his teeth and reach for the rubbish pile before Gavin had time to argue. "That's not a debate," Tom said pleasantly. "That's a fie hazard dressed as a keepsake." Every cleared box immediately attracted Cinders, who claimed each in turn with the territorial certainty of someone performing essential quality assessment, checking them for adequacy, and then moving on to the next. "We'll never get through them at this rate," Belinda said, though she stepped over him rather than moving him when she needed to pass. The shed was revealing itself, like a room reappearing after a long renovation, the back wall becoming visible for the first time in years and exposing hooks where tools might sensibly hang, and shelves that could function as intended, rather than as supporting structures for the boxes that had been stacked against them. By mid-afternoon, June arrived with her own set of categories, written on a sheet of paper in bold capitals. Eleanor arrived with a notebook. Sarah arrived with a length of bunting she had brought on the grounds that any significant village operation deserved it, and which she strung between the garden gate and the shed door with swift efficiency before anyone could raise a practical objection. They worked through the afternoon in the cheerful, focused way that comes when people are doing something communal and the tea keeps appearing at reasonable intervals. The pile outside the shed separated itself into 3 clear directions. The keep items against the garden wall, carefully sorted and covered against the chance of rain. The charity pile by the gate, growing into an impressive evidence of accumulated thoughtfulness. The rubbish destined for Saturday's skips, which Gavin found himself regarding with complicated feelings that he chose not to examine too closely. It was Pippa who found it. She had worked her way to the darkest corner of the shed, behind the toolbox that had proved immovable until Tom shifted it, and her hand closed around a small cardboard box tucked against the back wall. She lifted it into the light, turning it so the writing on the side was visible. Crook clock bits. The words seemed to arrive in the shed with a different quality of sound than anything else had managed that afternoon. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Everyone turned. Gavin's face did something complicated and mostly red, the flush coming up his neck and settling in his cheeks with the permanence of deep embarrassment finding its natural location. "That's nothing," he said, his voice arriving at a slightly higher register than intended. "Just some old bits. We can bin it." He reached for the box, but Belinda was faster. She opened it with the swift efficiency of someone who recognises when a thing needs to be looked at, rather than set aside. Inside, laid on a cloth and carefully oiled against corrosion, were brass components, small, precise, deliberately stored. "Clock parts," she said. "From the pub." She looked at Gavin steadily. Gavin Price. Is this why Arthur's clock hasn't worked for a decade? The shed went quiet in the particular way of spaces in which something important has just been said, and everyone is waiting to find out whether it will be acknowledged. Even Cinders had stopped washing. He sat on his current box, with his paws neatly placed, watching the proceedings with an expression of careful judicial interest. Gavin looked at the box, then at the assembled helpers, then at his hands, which had begun to betray him slightly. "I was going to fix it." The words came through with difficulty, through something that had been sitting on top of them for a long time. "I was 20, just out of college. Arthur asked if I knew about clocks, and I said yes, which was technically in the right direction, sort of." "You took it apart and couldn't get it back together," Pippa said, not unkindly, understanding arriving quietly in her expression. "I had bits left over." He stopped, started again. 3 bits, and I couldn't work out where they went, so I wrapped them up and put them somewhere I didn't have to look at them. The silence waited. Arthur never brought it up, said it looked lovely even without ticking, and I thought maybe he'd moved on, or didn't mind, or had forgotten. But I knew. I've known for 10 years that I broke Arthur Grimshaw's clock and was too ashamed to say so. And the longer it went on, the harder it got to say it. And then it had been 10 years, and I still hadn't said it. And so, instead, I kept it in a box in the shed. He ran out of words as efficiently as he had run out of breath. Belinda looked at the box in her hands for a moment. Then she looked at Gavin. "Well, she said, and her voice carried none of the judgment he had been dreading. I suppose we'd better work out what to do about that, hadn't we? Outside, the April afternoon continued its unhurried progress towards evening. Sarah's bunting moved gently in the light breeze, cheerful and unself-conscious. The sorted piles along the garden wall represented several hours of collective effort, decisions made and connections carefully preserved. But in the shed, in the corner where a decade's worth of avoidance had been quietly residing, a small cardboard box held something that had needed to come into the light for some time. Everyone who mattered now knew what it contained. The fix. Word moved through Little Mizzlewick with the particular velocity of news that matters, passing from Gavin's garden to the cobbled square to the shepherd's crook in the time it took the afternoon to settle into early evening. It travelled as significant news always does, accurately at first, then with a modest degree of elaboration added at each stage of its journey, so that by the time it reached Arthur through 3 separate vectors, he had a reasonably precise picture of events and only needed to wait for the source to arrive. By 6:30, Gavin finally walked to the pub. He had spent the time between Belinda's departure and his own walk down the lane doing something like preparation, and mostly managing something like resolution. The clock parts box was tucked under his arm. He had wrapped it in one of Sarah's spare cotton tea towels because carrying it in its original cardboard state felt too exposed, and he was aware this was probably not a rational distinction. The shepherd's crook held its usual Thursday evening complement of regulars. The lamplight was warm. The noise level was comfortable. It was, in every surface detail, an ordinary Thursday evening at the Crook, which was both exactly what Gavin had expected and somehow not quite what he had braced himself for. Arthur looked up from behind the bar. He was polishing a glass with his characteristic methodical attention, the cloth moving in steady circles. He set the glass down on the bar and looked at Gavin with an expression that was entirely attentive and entirely calm. "Evening, Gav," he said. "Pint." "Arthur, I'm sorry." The words came before Gavin had organised them into anything more considered, tumbling forward without waiting for arrangement. "I should have told you years ago. I broke your clock, and I was too ashamed to admit it, and I've known for 10 years, and every time I came in and saw it on the wall, I thought about saying something. And I never did. And I know that doesn't make it better, but I need you to know that I've felt terrible about it since the day I put those parts in a box and pretended it hadn't happened." He stopped. The pub had not gone silent, not quite, but conversations in the near vicinity had quietened in the way conversations do when people are listening without wishing to appear to be doing so. Arthur set down his polishing cloth. He came round the bar with the unhurried movement of a man who does most things at his own pace and has found this to be broadly effective. He put one hand on Gavin's shoulder, steadily, and the warmth of the gesture cracked something in Gavin's carefully maintained composure that he would not have predicted. "I know," Arthur said. "Always knew, lad." Gavin stared at him. "You knew?" "Course I did. Clock stopped working the week after you serviced it, and you developed a sudden passionate interest in your shoes every time you came within 6 feet of the bar. Didn't take much working out. But you never said anything. Never asked." "What would have been the point?" Arthur's expression was the kind of warmth that does not need to perform itself. "You were 20 years old, trying to be helpful, got in over your head. Happens to everyone. And you were clearly working up to saying something. Seemed unkind to rush you." 10 years, Gavin said, and the words came out not quite steady. Arthur considered this for a moment. "Some apples take longer to ripen than others," he said. "Doesn't mean they're bad apples." He picked up his cloth and returned to the bar with the air of a man who considers the essential part of a conversation concluded. "Now, can I get you a pint? Or are you going to stand there looking stricken until closing?" Leo jumped up from his corner table with the immediate energy of someone whose instincts had all engaged simultaneously. His phone was in his hand before he was fully upright. "This is exactly the kind of thing I started the channel to document," he said with a genuine excitement that stopped just short of theatrical. "A decade of mystery solved on a Thursday evening. We have to fix this. We have to get that clock working. We, Gavin said, still processing the weight of Arthur's calm acceptance, which was turning out to be harder to absorb than the confrontation he had spent 10 years dreading. Ben Carter appeared at Gavin's other shoulder, having arrived during the confession at some point without drawing attention to himself. Absolutely, we. I'm decent with mechanisms. You've got 10 years more experience than you had when you first attempted it. And Leo can find a tutorial on the internet for literally anything that has ever existed. Between the three of us, we can work this out. Leo was already navigating his phone with the focused attention of someone on a specific errand. Here. Repairing antique clock mechanisms, a complete guide. This one's got a proper workshop, detailed diagrams, a chap who clearly knows what he's talking about. Tomorrow afternoon, Ben said. Your shed still has floor space, presumably. We use it, we take our time, we sort it. Gavin accepted his pint from Arthur, whose expression across the bar was one of quiet, private amusement. He took a long drink and found that forgiveness, when it arrived after a decade of dreading it, had a taste he had not anticipated. It tasted a great deal like relief. He walked home through the April evening with the box tucked under his arm and the sky going deep blue above the hedgerows. Somewhere in the lane, a blackbird was still going, turning out notes with the unself-conscious commitment of a bird that has things to say and the light to say them in. The clock parts felt lighter under his arm than they had felt in the shed, and Gavin did not examine this too carefully in case it turned out to be his imagination. Tomorrow. They would try tomorrow. Friday arrived with the kind of unreasonably cheerful weather that seems designed by the universe to take a mild interest in the proceedings below. Sunlight came through the kitchen window and fell across the worktop in long oblongs. Birds were performing elaborate and overlapping musical announcements in the garden. Even Cinders, who had apparently decided that Gavin's property was worth a second visit, appeared at the side gate with his tail up and batted at a shadow on the path, with something that suggested he was in an unusually playful frame of mind for a cat of his dignified years. Gavin had spent the morning clearing space on the workbench, spreading the clock parts out carefully on a length of clean cloth, each piece separate, none of them touching. In the morning light, they were precise and beautiful. The brass worked smooth, the details small and deliberate. He had looked at them for a while before putting the kettle on. Ben and Leo arrived at 2:00, which was precisely what Ben had promised. Ben carried a toolkit of some comprehensiveness, while Leo bore his laptop alongside a level of enthusiasm that was perfectly genuine and only slightly exhausting. Right, Leo said, positioning his laptop on an upturned crate with the careful attention of someone arranging critical equipment. He had queued up 3 tutorials and had bookmarked a specialist forum for good measure. We have everything we need. Ben laid out his tools in a row, placing each one where it would be needed as they worked through the stages, with the systematic logic of someone who has spent time around machinery and knows that organisation is not pedantry, but the difference between a manageable problem and an escalating one. One step at a time, he said. Check against the video before each stage. No rushing. Gavin looked at the mechanism spread across his workbench and felt the familiar sensation of inadequate preparation meeting a task that required otherwise. What if I make it worse? He said, quietly enough that it was not quite addressed to either of them. Then we'll work it out, Ben said, without looking up from the tools. That's why there are 3 of us. Cinders, who had followed them to the shed and assessed the situation thoroughly, installed himself on the toolbox at the end of the workbench and arranged himself in a pose of maximum supervisory authority. Leo pulled up the first tutorial and a bearded man in a well-lit workshop appeared on screen, surrounded by the comfortable disorder of someone who uses their tools rather than displaying them, his voice carrying the particular enthusiasm of a person who genuinely enjoys what they are doing and is pleased to have an audience for it. Now, if you've got a striking train to deal with, the presenter said, drawing a diagram with a marker on a whiteboard behind him, The components that look redundant in the assembly are almost never actually redundant. The escapement in older bracket clocks often carries parts that new assemblers mistake for leftovers, but they're regulating the strike sequence. This is the single most common reassembly error, and it's entirely fixable. Gavin leaned forward until his nose was close to the screen. "That's it," he said very quietly. "That's exactly what happened. Those 3 pieces, I thought they were extra." "Pause it there," Ben said. He compared the diagram on screen to the parts on the cloth. "Look, these aren't spare. They're part of the mechanism that sequences the chiming. They go here, here, and here." "How did I miss that?" "Because you were 20 and no one had explained it to you, and you were too embarrassed to ask once you'd said you knew." Ben said it without judgment, with the matter-of-fact quality of someone identifying a cause rather than assigning blame. It's not very complicated from the outside, looking back. It never is. They worked with the focused concentration of people engaged in something that mattered beyond the immediate task. The tutorial paused and replayed at intervals, Ben double-checking each stage before they moved to the next. Gavin's hands steadier as the hour progressed, the mechanism taking shape on the cloth with an accumulating logic that had been entirely invisible to him at 20. Cinders shifted position periodically to maintain his optimal supervisory angle, apparently satisfied with the general standard of effort on display. "There," Gavin said at last, settling the final component of the escapement into place with a small, precise click. "That's where it belongs. It's obvious now. How was it not obvious before?" "Because you were looking at it from inside the embarrassment," Leo said, which was unexpectedly perceptive for someone who was simultaneously annotating his footage notes. He caught their expressions. "I have layers," he said. "I don't just do running commentary." They located the correct video for the spring adjustment, and Gavin wound the key with the particular quality of care that comes when you know the last time you did something it went wrong and you are not certain whether the wrong was in the doing or in you. For a moment, nothing happened. The mechanism sat in its restored arrangement and declined to commit. Then, very quietly, tick. The sound was hesitant, feeling its way like someone testing a word they have not used in a long time. Tick. More confident now, finding its footing. Tick, tick, tick. Cinders' ears moved forward simultaneously, a small, involuntary response to an unexpected sound. His tail swished once. "We did it," Leo said, in the near whisper of someone not wanting to disturb something fragile. Then, louder as conviction arrived, "We actually did it." Ben clapped Gavin on the shoulder with enough force to nearly remove him from the stool. 10 years' experience, YouTube tutorials, and a cat providing moral support. Not bad for a Friday afternoon. Gavin sat quite still, listening to the mechanism count the seconds it had not been counting for a decade. There was something building in his chest that he could not have named precisely, but it had the general character of a weight being set down. "We still need the chiming mechanism," Ben said, consulting the laptop where the tutorial had moved on. "That's what uses those 3 components. That's the actual test." They approached the chiming mechanism with care and with the confidence that comes from having just succeeded at something you had feared. The tutorial was followed precisely. Each stage verified. The chiming mechanism, Ben noted, had to be wound simultaneously with the hammer held steady, then both released together to allow the strike sequence to engage. Ben held the mechanism. Gavin wound the spring. They looked at each other briefly. "Released together." The spring departed from the mechanism with a velocity that suggested it had been waiting for the opportunity. It struck Leo's laptop screen with a sound like a small but determined bell, ricocheted at an angle that seemed to involve more physics than the space should have permitted, made contact with Gavin's forehead with a small, clear note, and landed in Cinders' water bowl with an indignant splash. The 3 of them went entirely still. Cinders, from his toolbox, looked at the water bowl. He looked at the 3 humans. He descended from the toolbox with the composed deliberateness of an individual who has been gravely inconvenienced and wishes this to be understood, removed himself to a cardboard box in the corner and began grooming himself with the pointed thoroughness of someone who is performing dignity under difficult circumstances. "Right," Gavin said, one hand pressed to his forehead where a small red mark was forming. "Does the chiming mechanism need that spring?" Leo retrieved it from the water bowl, holding it up between two fingers. According to the video, yes, definitely yes. Then we dry it off, clean it properly, and we try again. Gavin lowered his hand and found the white spirit Tom had left during the clearing. Slowly this time, and perhaps with slightly better coordination. 20 minutes of careful cleaning and drying followed, conducted in the quiet of 3 people who have just learned something specific about their own method and are incorporating the lesson without discussion. The spring was reinstalled, the positions were adjusted, the approach was modified to something considerably more considered. "On 3, Ben said. They released together. The mechanism settled into place with a click that had the precise quality of a thing fitting where it was intended to fit. Gavin set the clock to strike the hour. They waited. The chime came. It was slightly off-key, with the particular character of a mechanism finding its voice after a long silence, uncertain at the edges, not quite trusting the air, but it was unmistakably a chime, clear enough to carry, deliberate enough to mean something, announcing time in the way it had announced time for a great many years before Gavin's 20-year-old confidence had silenced it. Even Cinders emerged from his box to acknowledge this, sitting at the shed entrance with a composure that suggested the water bowl incident had been considered and provisionally forgiven. "Time to take it home," Gavin said, and did not trust himself to say anything further on the subject. Ben began wrapping the clock in old blankets, building careful layers for the journey to the Crook. Leo packed up his laptop. The afternoon was moving towards evening through the shed window, the light going golden long, Sarah's bunting catching it at intervals and turning briefly bright before the breeze took it again. The 3 of them walked towards the village centre, carrying the clock between them, moving at the pace the object required. Above the lane, rooks were making their way back through the sky in the unhurried procession of creatures who have somewhere specific to be and are not particularly rushed about getting there. The resolution. The Shepherd's Crook held its usual Friday evening in full. The comfortable noise of conversation and the warm smell of a pub that has been a pub for a long time. Lamplight doing what lamplight does best in old rooms. The reliable sound of Arthur working steadily behind the bar. Several of the usual regulars had arrived at slightly earlier times than their custom, for reasons they had each described to themselves as coincidence. Arthur looked up as the door opened. He set down the glass he had been filling with the careful deliberateness of a man who is setting down a glass because something requires his full attention. Gavin, Ben and Leo stood in the doorway carrying something in blankets, the 3 of them arranged with the particular quality of people arriving with purpose. Conversation did not stop. It did something quieter than stopping. It continued, but at a reduced volume, the way conversations adjust when the room understands that something is happening that might be worth hearing. "Evening, lads," Arthur said. "Can I get you something?" "Actually," Gavin said, and his voice had a steadiness in it that he was glad of. "We've brought you something." They moved to the bar. Gavin unwrapped the blankets in stages, careful and deliberate, and the clock came into the light of the pub as it had not done for 10 years. The brass face caught the lamplight immediately, that warm golden quality it had always had. The hands showed 23 minutes past 6, adjusted during the walk to match the actual hour. And from within the mechanism came the quiet, unhurried tick that had been absent since he was 20, and didn't know enough to know what he didn't know. The room listened to its own quiet. Then the clock found its voice, and said so. Arthur's hands, which had been moving towards another glass with the automatic efficiency of long practice, stopped. He set them flat on the bar. He looked at the clock for a moment without saying anything, the particular look of someone registering something they had made their peace with and are now being required to unmake it. "You fixed it," he said. "I broke it," Gavin said. "I know," Arthur said. "I know you did." He came round the bar and stood before the clock, reached out and touched the brass face with the careful attention of someone reacquainting themselves with something familiar. He lifted it, tested the weight of it, relearned the feel of it in his hands. Then he moved to the wall. Ben stepped forward to help with the mounting, steadying the clock while Arthur positioned the bracket with the precision of a man who knows exactly where a thing belongs, because it has belonged there before. Leo filmed the whole process with an unusual quiet, his commentary absent, recognising that the moment had its own weight and did not need annotating. When the clock was level, when they had all stepped back to look at it, Arthur reached up and wound the key one final turn. The tick settled into the room like something returning to its proper place, each beat distinct, then dissolving into the general sound of the pub the way familiar things do when they are no longer remarkable because they are simply there. People returned to their conversations. The quality of the room had shifted in a way that would have been difficult to describe, but was noticeable in the same way that a draft stopping is noticeable. Not dramatic, simply better. Arthur drew 3 pints without being asked and set them on the bar. He lifted his own glass, and the gesture collected the attention of those nearby with no effort at all. "To fixing old mistakes," he said. "To YouTube tutorials," Leo offered. "To things worth keeping," Gavin said, quietly. They drank. The first chime came at the half hour, the clock announcing its return with the off-key note that would become, Gavin realised, a familiar characteristic rather than a flaw. Conversations paused mid-sentence, heads turned, and then Sarah, who had come in during the toast and was standing near the fireplace with Eleanor, began to applaud. It spread quickly around the room, not the formal applause of ceremonies, but the warmer, more spontaneous kind that comes when people realise they have been missing something without quite knowing it. The sound reached Arthur behind the bar. He looked at the clock, then at his glass, and did not say anything, which was its own kind of eloquence. Later, people came to Gavin with the casual warmth that is better than ceremony. A hand on the shoulder, a comment offered in passing, Tom telling him about a set of gates he had been too proud to ask for help hanging for 2 years before his wife had pointed out that asking was not the same as failing. Nora said nothing directly, but found him at the bar and stood beside him for a while, companionably, in the way that people who have known a village long enough understand the value of presence over words. Eleanor Vance, gathering her coat to leave at 8:30, paused beside him. "The clock sounds well," she said. "Slightly off," Gavin said. "Most old things are, once you really listen to them." She put on her coat with her usual composure. "It doesn't make them wrong. It just makes them specific." She left. Gavin thought about that for a while. He walked home through the April night, the village quiet around him, windows throwing their warm oblongs onto the pavement. The sky above the lane was clear enough to show properly, the kind of country dark that happens away from town light, the stars specific and plentiful. He could still hear the last of the blackbird going at it somewhere in a garden hedge, indefatigable. Saturday arrived with the promised skips positioned outside the village hall, their metal sides catching the early sun. Belinda had established a sorting station by 8 o'clock, before most people had finished their first tea, directing the arrival of bags and boxes with the pleasant efficiency of someone who finds real satisfaction in the correct arrangement of things. The village turned out. This was not in doubt. It never had been. Little Mizzlewick turns out. People came with boxes and bags, with furniture and oddments, with the accumulated material of lives that had happened in one place long enough to leave evidence. Ruth Henderson brought 2 full boxes of fabric and received 4 separate comments about the quality of the hall. Major Burns appeared at 9 o'clock with a box of books, 3 of them military histories and 1 a collected trollop, and left it with Eleanor, who was managing the donations table, nodding to her with the formal courtesy he applied equally to everyone, and which everyone had long since understood, to be warmth rather than distance. June ran the disposal pile with the categorical certainty of a woman who has made up her mind about what constitutes useful and what constitutes optimism in a bin bag, and was rarely argued with. Tom and Gavin spent the morning going where they were needed, lifting and carrying and moving furniture that had been too awkward or heavy for one person. The work was physical and satisfying in the specific way of effort that has an obvious result at the end of it. By the mid-morning break, when Belinda declared refreshments, the skip was respectable and the donation pile had reached an impressive scale. People gathered at the trestle tables Sarah and Nora had laid out with sandwiches, slices of Pippa's lemon cake and a quantity of tea that suggested they had anticipated a larger crowd or a longer operation, or both. The conversation settled naturally into the kind of ease that shared work creates. Gavin found himself in a group with Tom, Graham Henderson and Alfie Crane, who had finished his morning round and come to lend a hand, talking about the specific irrationality of things you keep for no defensible reason. 17 jam jars, Gavin said. No lids. I kept them for 2 years. Tom, bent nails. A whole tobacco tin full of them, none of them usable. Couldn't explain why. Graham, with the air of a man making a confession. 6 dictionaries. I run a stationery shop. I kept 6 dictionaries in my shed. Alfie smiled into his tea and said nothing, which was Alfie's contribution to most conversations and was, in its way, perfectly sufficient. There was something comfortable in the accumulation of small, admitted absurdities, people recognising in each other the same difficulty with letting things go that they had experienced in themselves, the same habit of keeping what represents possibility even when the possibility has grown impractical. By late afternoon, Belinda pronounced the operation complete. The skip was full. The donations were sorted and stacked for collection. Little Mizzlewick looked, to anyone paying attention, as though something had been set down. The shepherd's crook filled early that evening, people arriving in work clothes, still carrying the comfortable tiredness of a day spent usefully. The clock ticked above the bar. Arthur had wound it that morning and would wind it again tomorrow, establishing without announcement a new daily routine. Near the fireplace, Belinda said quietly to Eleanor, I think the most important thing we cleared out this week wasn't in the rubbish pile at all. Eleanor, who had been expecting something along these lines from Belinda, allowed this to stand on its own. Sunday morning came in gently, as Sunday mornings tend to in April, with the softened light of a sky that has not yet committed to its day. Gavin woke early, made tea, and took it to the back step. The shed door was visible from where he stood. He had left it properly latched last night for the first time in a while, now that the hinges had been oiled and the latch no longer required a specific technique to engage. Inside, things were in their places, tools on the pegboards, wood sorted by length and type, the floor visible. The boxes that remained were labelled honestly. He had come out here a few mornings ago and told the shed it would be all right, which had been a ridiculous thing to say and probably true, and had turned out to be true in a way he had not meant but was glad of. He drank his tea. Cinders appeared at the side gate, somewhat earlier than expected for a cat of his usual habits, and came down the path without particular urgency, settling beside Gavin's foot with the air of a cat who has determined that this spot is adequate. Gavin reached down and scratched behind Marmalade ears. Cinders produced a measured purr and permitted it. The April morning continued its gentle business around them, the birds going at it in the hedgerow, the light coming up slowly over the garden wall, the village beginning its Sunday in the quiet way of a place that knows how to rest. Above the bar at the Shepherd's Crook, the clock was ticking. It would tick through the spring and the summer, through the pub quiz evenings and the autumn gatherings, through the seasonal rhythms of a village that has its own particular pace. Its chime would always carry that slightly off-key note, the specific character of an old mechanism finding its voice again after a long silence, and in time, people would stop registering it as imperfection and simply hear it as the clock. Which was, in the end, exactly what it was.
And so we leave Little Mizzlewick a little clearer, a little lighter, and with one old clock finding its voice again above the bar. Thank you for listening. If something in Gavin's shed or in the village's gentle sorting reminded you of anything you have kept for years, do share it in the comments. A Little Mizzlewick story from once and otherwhere, where small stories have big hearts.